Welcome to Learn at Lunchtime. So glad everybody could join us today. I am Sherry Trimble, one of the museum educators here at the State Museum. I'd like to welcome my fellow museum educator, Beth Erickson, and turn it over to her.
Thank you, Sherry. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is Adventures in Nature Lab, and our topic today is the Susquehanna River, its history, and the fishes that live there. With us is Jeff Smith, a Susquehanna River biologist with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. He has a unique background working on large river systems across the eastern United States. Jeff's work includes routine monitoring and management of various game fish species, but also includes more research-related topics. Since 2009, Jeff has helped lead a group of interdisciplinary researchers that focused on factors associated with the smallmouth bass population decline and disease. In recent years, his research focus has expanded to better understanding the dynamics of the invasive flathead catfish species found in the Susquehanna River and its tributaries. This work is focused on documenting the species' abundance, distribution, growth rates, and the diet of the species in collaboration with Penn State University. Hello, Jeff. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That's great. So we have a lot of people interested in this topic. The river is a big part of our life here near Harrisburg. So tell us about what you do with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission and what the job is of a Susquehanna River biologist.
Yeah, so I work in the group of fisheries management. My colleagues and I monitor game fish populations around the state, and my particular focus is the Susquehanna River. We will do routine surveys of different species, and we use that data to help us manage these populations. But I also do quite a bit of research in what I do. So in our talk today, we're going to focus on some of that species discussion, and then get into some of the research that my cooperators and I are conducting on different species. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history and current events of the Susquehanna River. And this goes from ancient history to current. So when we're talking history, we're talking old history. So we're going to start with the history of the Susquehanna River, and we'll move into a species profile, or two species profiles in this case, and some of the research we're doing in those, and then have time for a Q&A session at the end. So the Susquehanna River is an ancient river. Susquehanna, the New River, which runs through North Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia, are believed to be the oldest rivers in North America, somewhere around 240 to 300 million years ago. So the Susquehanna River actually existed during Pangea. So in some form, it was here during the supercontinent. And it predates the Appalachian Mountains. And the mountains formed when the African plate and the North American plate collided. And the mountains pushed up at the same time as the river cut down. So kind of a unique scenario. Instead of rivers cutting, this was here first, and the mountains pushed up through it. So kind of interesting fact about this river system. And living where we live, we hear a lot about the connection to the Chesapeake Bay. During the last ice age, though, the Chesapeake Bay did not exist. Large amounts of global water were tied up in ice sheets and glaciers, so the sea levels dropped, and the Susquehanna River flowed much further to the south. And the Susquehanna cut the channel for what we now consider the Chesapeake Bay, and it still provides more than half of the freshwater flow to the bay. So in the last 18,000 or so years, not a lot has happened, right? The glaciers receded. Conditions changed to be closer to what we recognize today. The species recolonized the river after this occurred. Some humans made their way to North America, and then some more humans made their way to North America, and a host of environmental insults, both historical and current, occurred. So since that time, there have been several alterations to the watershed. During the 1800s, the Susquehanna Basin helped build the growing country and the big growing United States. And this included deforestation, mineral extraction, agriculture, and dams, and some species introductions. And for the purpose of this talk, we're going to spend most of our time focusing on these two factors, including some of the research on some of these species that have been introduced. The Susquehanna River was first dammed in the early 1800s. Currently, we have 4 hydropower dams, 2 low head dams, and 1 inflatable dam present in the Susquehanna River. These are impediments to fish movement and have resulted in the extirpation or near extirpation of some fish species from different portions of the river. In recent years, efforts between our agency, some other agencies, and the federal government and energy providers have resulted in efforts to bypass some of the dams and restore some species, like American shad and river herring, and more recently, American eels. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Sherry.
No, it's Beth. I have a
Sorry.
question about the dams. So the dams, the purpose of the dams is for electricity, and then what other purpose?
Cooling water.
Okay.
So the 4 hydropower dams were obviously for electricity.
Okay.
One of the Lowhead dams was built to provide cooling water for a power plant that no longer exists. Another one was built for sanitation, was the reason they initially cited. And the inflatable dam is for recreation, for boating in a portion of the river. So it's only inflated seasonally, and it'll deflate for 4 or 5 months a year, and then reinflate again in the spring to allow for recreational boating.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the creation of these dams and the species limitations that they caused were actually the reason for the creation of the predecessor for the Fish and Boat Commission in 1866. So with the building of the dams, there was some unintended consequences. And the one we hear most about is it reduced or eliminated American shad runs in the Susquehanna River. Another side effect is it also greatly reduced American eel populations. And when we talk about American eel, they have a different life cycle than most of the migratory fish we talk about. They're a catadromous species, which lives in fresh water and then spawns in the ocean. So it's really the opposite of American shad or Atlantic salmon or some of the other salmon species we hear about. So the adult eel will live in the rivers for a long period of time and then go out to the ocean and spawn. And the elvers or juvenile eels will return back to the river early in life. With the dams in place, the elvers could not make it back upriver to complete the life cycle. We also see poor success of emigrating adults passing through the turbines. In this upper slide here, you see damage to an American eel that passed through the turbines at York Haven Dam last fall. Mortality is quite high going back through, so the adults that live here are not making it back or making it back in low numbers to the ocean to spawn. As another consequence of this, we're seeing a decline of the freshwater mussel, eastern liptio, seen here in the lower right. It needs the American eel to complete its life cycle. So we're seeing a reduction in those over time as the eels are not in place to move the glochidia or juvenile eels around. And in doing so, we lose the filtering capacity these huge mussel beds would have had and the ecosystem services that come with them. So the kind of the trickle down effect of these dams spans different species and also other aspects of this ecosystem. We currently recognize about 120 species in the Susquehanna drainage, fish species that is, I'm sorry. However, not all of these are riverine. So here are a set of our common players that we talk about when we deal with the river. In the upper left, you'll see bluegill. To the right of that, the walleye. To the right of that is one of my colleagues holding a muskellage, a large piscivorous species in this case in the upper Susquehanna River. In the second row left, we have the red breast sunfish, one of our really colorful, cool native sunfishes. To the right of him is a juvenile striped bass. To the right of that, on the second row right, is the shield darter, a small darter, a member of the perch family, native to the Susquehanna River. In the lower left, we have a quillback, which is a riverine sucker species. It's a pretty cool fish. In the center, the very colorful pumpkin seed, another member of the sunfish family. In the lower right, a really neat species, the Chesapeake log perch, endemic to the Susquehanna River. In fact, the only remaining population is in the lower Susquehanna River at this time. And some of my colleagues, as well as people from Susquehanna River Basin Commission, Maryland DNR, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, are currently working to restore this species in the lower Susquehanna River. Pretty neat fish that was on its way out, and they're doing some really excellent work to bring it back.
So the fish that you mentioned that are found in the river, the ones that are found in the Susquehanna River are not necessarily found in surrounding streams, like for example, Trout Run or other streams of the area. So they're specific to the Susquehanna?
Some of these are. Most of these are pretty ubiquitous species, but more riverine. So for instance, the shield darter has pretty wide distribution, favors rivers and large streams more, but can be found in smaller streams. Bluegills are found throughout many lakes and ponds around the area, as well as pumpkin seeds. But the majority of these species are more riverine forms. And one of the common factors that's affected this basin are species introductions. And right now, more than 1/3 of the species in the Susquehanna River drainage are introduced. Historically, the Susquehanna River and its drainage would not have been very diverse. Glaciation would have limited resident fish at that time. So we've only got about 18,000 years or so for these species to move back in. So we really wouldn't have had many species, probably somewhere around 60 is the estimate, living in this system native to this drainage. And we've seen several introductions since then. And here are two of them. In the upper right, a channel catfish. And in the lower left here, one that's gotten a little bit more attention lately is this northern snakehead.
So the species as they're introduced, it's usually the result of human interaction that causes the introduction? Or
Correct.
is it something? Okay, go ahead.
Most of them are human.
Okay.
Some have come on their own accord as a result of other introductions in other places. So for instance, the northern snakehead was introduced in the Potomac drainage, and high flow events in recent years lowered the salinity of the bay, and they were able to migrate north to the upper Susquehanna River, to Conowingo Dam, and then pass through the dam. So some are here through their own movement, others came directly through human introduction. So the routes have varied over time.
Thanks.
For the rest of the presentation, we're going to focus on two of these species. Both introduced, one purposely introduced and now naturalized. The other, we're not quite sure of the origin, but it's considered an aquatic invasive species. We're going to talk about the smallmouth bass and the flathead catfish.
So Jeff, before you go on, you used the term naturalized. Can you
Yes.
explain that a little more?
The introduction was long enough ago that they've now kind of found their way and are more accepted in the system. They've been here long enough, several generations. They're more a part of the current fabric. A lot of the damages have been done, and we would have missed what those damages are.
Okay.
And now we've moved on to species that are more recent, and we're kind of dealing with those changes more real time, and we're kind of adjusting as we go.
Okay.
So our first one, the smallmouth bass, Micropter stolomew. It's named after a French geologist. It was native to the upper Mississippi and Great Lakes drainages. And of the black basses, it's more riverine than the custrian, meaning it likes lakes and streams more than rivers or lakes and ponds. So smallmouth bass were introduced in 1869 or 1870 by a group of industrious anglers. This is something we frown upon heavily now. In fact, it would be a violation of the Lacey Act, federal law, to import species across the state line. So these anglers were jealous of a group of anglers that bought some fish and stocked them in the Delaware River. So they contacted a commercial fisherman from Harper's Ferry on the Potomac River and bought some fish. They bought 25 fish for roughly $1 a piece. And in today's dollars, that'd be right around $20 a fish. Quite a bit of money for a fish to stock. To give you a point of reference, each of our adult trout we stock each spring roughly costs about $3 a piece to raise. So they were pretty adamant to get this fish in the river system. And from all that we can find in the contemporary literature, they were abundant within 3 years of introduction. So putting this fish in this system, they took off. It's actually perfect habitat for them. So it's no surprise that they've expanded the way they have. Black bass, which includes smallmouth bass, are the most popular game fish nationally. And if you look at Pennsylvania, they're most popular in terms of the number of anglers that say they target them. So there are actually more people identify as targeting bass than trout in Pennsylvania, believe it or not.
That's a surprising fact, because if you had asked me, I would have guessed trout, because you hear a lot about people fishing for trout in Pennsylvania, but so bass is the winner.
In terms of people fishing for them. Now, the time spent, trout wins, but
okay.
So we look at two metrics, and they kind of share one of each of the metrics. So I would argue that the state is a bass state, while other people would say a trout state, but that's what I focus on. So we'll pick that one.
There you go.
It's the most popular game fish species for recreational anglers in the Susquehanna River. A survey we conducted in 2007 found that nearly 67,000 angler trips targeting smallmouth bass were carried out in a 6-month period in 2007. And these accounted for more than 286,000 angler hours spent targeting smallmouth bass during that 6-month period. So just give you a ballpark reference, that's about 32 years of time were spent by anglers in a 6-month period targeting smallmouth bass.
That's a lot of time fishing.
Yeah, and it results in an economic contribution of nearly $2 million annually in
Wow.
this small stretch of the Susquehanna and Lower Juniata River. So it does a lot for the local economies as well.
That's great.
However, beginning in 2005, we began to see disease show up in young of year smallmouth bass or fish spawned in the spring of each year. Disease occurrence were widespread, but it primarily affected the middle and lower Susquehanna River and Juniata rivers. And when we look closer to this fish, we found a whole host of things going on, including bacterial, viral, and parasite pathogens present when we analyze these fish. The impacts of these diseases was it affected recruitment. Smallmouth bass reproductive ecology is kind of buoyed by 1 or 2 good, strong year classes in 4 or 5. So periodic good years and several poor years. So what we're seeing was no new fish coming into this population. If we look at the graphic in the upper right, we are comparing the length frequency or the catch rate of different sizes of fish prior to disease, which are the blue diamonds, and following disease or during disease, which are the yellow squares. With the length groups of fish across the bottom here, let me see if I can get my cursor moving, from 3 inches up to 20. So if we compare the pre-disease period, we see high catch rates of small fish. However, once disease occurred, we no longer see these small fish coming into the population. We're left with a lower number of large adult fish, but nothing coming back in. Oops, sorry there. Come on. And we saw was consecutive poor year classes. We have in smallmouth populations, 1 or 2 good year classes really drive a population for many years, but we were seeing consecutive poor year classes. There was no building. And what this resulted is a decline in the adult abundance. So in the lower right graphic, we have our catch rate of adult bass. And you see prior to the onset of disease, we had what are high catch rates of adult smallmouth bass. However, following the onset of disease, you see these populations drop drastically, and we kind of had this static population of adult fish that was really much lower than we saw in the past, primarily because no new fish were coming in.
So even though it was a fish that was not native, it's naturalized, and the removal of it at this point would be detrimental to the environmental system.
Yes, the ecology of the system would change without this species present.
Okay.
It's now become part of the fabric of this watershed, and it would change a number of different factors. So in kind of investigating these disease occurrences, we found several different things, some unanticipated, and others kind of helped shed a light on a lot of what was going on. We'll talk a little bit about largemouth bass virus, some intersex and immune suppression, the large-scale movement patterns documented through radiotelemetry, and a condition I get a lot of questions about, which is blotchy bass syndrome. So our first one is largemouth bass virus. As the name implies, it's not a thought to affect smallmouth bass. However, when we'd send our samples away for analysis, this was one of the common pathogens we saw almost consistently throughout all the samples we submitted. The signs of disease associated with largemouth bass virus, however, look much different than what we were seeing in our fish in the environment. So we partnered with Michigan State in a laboratory study funded by Pennsylvania Sea Grant and determined that it can in fact affect smallmouth bass. And this occurrence was actually strongly temperature dependent. And we typically saw this in the summer when temperatures were warm. And the signs of disease that they documented in the lab actually look quite different, or quite similar, to what we saw in the wild. and different from what affects largemouth bass. And when we coupled these together with some other pathogens like bacteria or parasites, we saw that mortality rate increase. So based on those findings, it's an important factor in the large-scale mortality events we observed in the past, along with some of the other pathogens that are present and some immune suppression. Another finding that we kind of stumbled upon by accident was intersex or reproductive endocrine disruption. These are documented by testicular oocytes, which are egg precursor cells in the testes of the male smallmouth bass. We were looking at juveniles, and one of the thoughts was maybe something about the adults is predisposing the juveniles. So when we looked, sure enough, there was something there that they weren't quite expecting. And my cooperators from USGS, Leetown Science Center, were paramount in kind of putting this all together. In addition, they also found a blood protein, vitellogenin, in the plasma of the bass that we sampled. So vitellogenin is actually an egg precursor protein and should not be found in male bass, but was present in measurable concentrations. So there was clear signs that some sort of reproductive endocrine disruption was going on, and it was a sign of exposure to these type of compounds that do this sort of activity. Some of these same compounds, however, can also affect the immune system. And as we've been kind of building our background and knowledge, we kind of went with this common assumption that immune system suppression was going on. And a collaborative effort we did among several agencies called the CADIS process with Pennsylvania DEP. This was one of the resulting outcomes, that there was some level of immune suppression. But at the time, we had no way to evaluate it. So the Leetown Science Center crowd got together and actually developed a technique, a methodology to evaluate immune suppression in fish. And they demonstrated that some of the populations where we saw our biggest problems also had signs of immune suppression. So we identified a need, and they developed a science to kind of answer the questions that we have. And that science is now being used for other fish species across North America. So it was originally developed to kind of answer our question about smallmouth bass. Another interesting finding was large-scale movements among bass in this population. Megan Kepler-Shaw was working on her PhD at Penn State and did a telemetry project on some of our bass populations that were the focus of our study. And we found that they made large seasonal movements, the scale and scope of which we really didn't fully comprehend until we tracked them. The average fish movement was roughly 15 miles. We had one fish that moved 73 miles during the survey period. So they moved a lot further than we thought, and more of them moved than we thought as well. And we found that they were tributary and river spawning individuals. So some fish stayed in the river and spawned, while others went to tributaries to spawn each year. And they actually moved further up the tributaries than we expected. And also they moved in greater numbers. So many of the fish we found in tributaries were actually river fish that went there to spawn during that spring season. And then once spawning was over, returned to the river to spend out the rest of the year. Megan also was able to identify a condition called spawning site fidelity. So these fish came back to the same exact location 2 years in a row to spawn. So they found a nice place and came back. What we're not sure is whether that was natal homing or not. So the additional studies will need to identify that. But these fish that were tagged came back to, in some cases, within a few meters of where they were at the year before.
Can you explain a little bit about what that term is you just used?
With the spawning site fidelity?
Well, that too.
Okay.
But I was thinking that, is it natal homing? Is that
Natal
what you
homing.
said? Okay.
Yeah, natal homing is what salmon are thought to do. So they find their way back through olfactory senses to the location in which they were spawned. So we're not sure if the fish we saw moving back to the same location did that as a natal homing behavior, or whether they just found a spawning site that was suitable for them and came back year after year. So we know the year after year thing occurred. We don't know if that's where those fish were spawned or not. So some additional study down the road by some other people may help to identify that. The other factor we identified in these populations were large wintering aggregations. So for an instance, this area we studied, almost all the fish came to one pool in the winter to spend the winter. So most of the river was void of smallmouth bass, and they were all congregated in one large pool. during the winter, which is something we also didn't expect as well. To see it, how many and what proportion the fish moved was a little bit staggering, but they did. They all left and came there, and then once spring rolled around, back to their spawning locations. And the last factor we've worked on that's garnered a lot of attention is a condition called blotchy bass syndrome, or hyperpigmented melanosis. This condition has puzzled researchers for decades. They always thought the conditions were associated with water quality, and to some respect, we did as well. It really received a lot of attention around in the Susquehanna beginning in 2012. A lot of people noticed this in some of the fish, and with all the other tension around disease that was in place, this kind of made headlines and led to a lot of discussions. We began looking at these fish at that time to kind of figure out what's going on, and we've recently found the USGS cooperators might have found that it was actually associated with a virus, not contaminants like which is first thought. And it's a reaction of the fish to the viral load. We don't believe it harms the fish in any way. It's just an aggregation of pigments in those areas. But we're still trying to understand the details, why it spreads, why it's in some places more frequently. And also there appears to be a seasonal aspect of it that we're not sure about. So we're still in the process of trying to understand all the details of this, but it's a really interesting phenomena that gets a lot of public attention.
Is this unique to bass in the Susquehanna River, or has it been seen in other rivers as well?
It's been seen all over North America. It's unique among bass, it seems. We don't see it in other species groups, but for largemouth bass and smallmouth bass, we see it widespread across the Susquehanna, but we've seen it reported in many other places, and we see it frequently in photos of fish from other parts of the country. So not unique to the Susquehanna, probably most talked about in the Susquehanna though. And this seems to be largely restricted to black basses though. And our second species we'll talk about is the flathead catfish, Biologist olivaris, named for the olive yellow color they commonly display. And if you squint real hard, you can kind of make it out in this individual I'm holding here.
It's a huge fish.
Yeah, and this is just a moderate sized one. Native to the Mississippi and Gulf Coast drainages, largely piscivorous, so it eats almost entirely fish. And the thought of its introduction was illegal introduction by anglers. We are currently working on some genetic stuff to see if that is the origin or not. Three different methods were thought to be how they arrive, but the current consensus is illegal introduction by anglers. But catfish have been introduced throughout the eastern seaboard. From most of the work has occurred from Georgia to Virginia on those populations. They've been found to impact game fish species of concern, and also migratory species like American shad and river herring that all these agencies are working to restore. Highly adaptable species seems to be able to survive in just about any type of condition. And that large gape, large mouth size you see allows them to eat just about anything. So one of our focuses of research is distribution. And the graphic you see here on the right is a distribution or range expansion from a paper we just completed for North American Journal of Fisheries Management. The rapid range expansion since introduction is thought to be volitional or on their own, as well as human aided. In the top frame here, the one labeled A, we're looking at the early years of introduction from 2000 to 2006. In the second frame, the B frame, that period of time is 2007 to 2013. And then C, the bottom frame, is the most recent period from 2008 to 2019. As you can see, the number of dots and the distribution of those dots has increased greatly in that roughly 20-year time span. We need to learn a little bit more about the factors, though, that influence this expansion, what they like, what they dislike, and we need to focus mostly on places that they don't yet exist. And we need to understand what the existing fish communities look like there, as well as some of the conditions that exist there, because maybe those are conditions that are less favorable to them as the reason they've not invaded. So we're still in the process of this work, but we're going to continue to monitor how this species expands its range throughout the Atlantic slope in Pennsylvania, the Delaware drainage, and the Susquehanna drainage.
So they end up in the Susquehanna River because people have fished somewhere else, enjoyed that fish, and then bring it up to where they live so they can fish it again?
And that's the thought.
Okay.
That's the current thought on how this worked. And I'll kind of see if I can get my cursor to work here. This population here in the upper Susquehanna is one of those range expansions that's thought to have occurred that way. We've got about a 40 or 50 mile gap here where they don't exist. So this is usually pretty indicative of someone moving them from somewhere else after to try to establish them there. And the population genetics we're working on also suggests that as well, because these fish don't match the ones in other portions of the Susquehanna. So they were likely distributed from somewhere else. Another factor we're looking at is growth. We're seeing rapid growth compared to flathead catfish in their native range. This is a pretty common phenomenon in invasive species. Their growth goes unchecked because they've got no competition or predators. And the other flathead populations along the eastern seaboard have also displayed the same characteristic rapid growth. In this graphic, we're looking at two populations, the Three Rivers population out near Pittsburgh in their native range, and the Susquehanna population in its invasive range. And what we're seeing here is the curve on here, the line is the growth rate. And what it's demonstrating is when they reach their maximum theoretical length up here, they're very similar, about 50 millimeters different, or about 2 inches. In the Three Rivers, it takes them roughly 45 years to reach that maximum. However, we're seeing that same maximum reached in the Susquehanna in right about 20. So there's roughly a twofold growth rate increase between the native population and this invasive population, which is pretty typical among invasive populations. We're also seeing that some of the factors that control growth are not infecting these populations. So growth rates are commonly controlled by latitude or growing season. And those factors seem to be irrelevant when it comes to invasive populations, including the Susquehanna population. So in order to see this rapid growth, something must be fueling it. And that leads to our next component of our research, which is diet. So looking at what the flathead catfish are eating. As I mentioned previously, from all the studies that have been done, they're largely piscivorous. They're mostly fish eating, which is different than most catfishes. The previous studies that have been done involve prey communities that are different than what we see here in the Susquehanna. So what we learn is going to be quite different because what makes up their diet is going to be different. And we're currently working on the field component of this, and we're hoping to complete it later this year. So in this upper right slide, what you're looking at, let's go back, is a flathead catfish mouth. Here's the teeth here. And this is a tail of another fish sticking out of the esophagus of a flathead catfish. And in the lower slide is one of the diets that we've extracted from one of the catfish. In this case, it's a mixture of crayfish and fish. And let me get our cursor moving again. Here's a partially decomposed fish, or digested fish, I guess I should say, along with some crayfish parts. So they have a really complex diet in this system, and they're eating quite a bit, but we want to understand how that affects the other portions or other species in this community.
To understand a little bit more about the catfish, so do they swallow their prey whole?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
so they just basically open their mouth and take in what they can.
Correct.
Wow.
What we're seeing is they're largely benthic species, so they live on the bottom of the river, really strongly associated with cover objects, boulders and logs. They probably lie in wait and gobble down whatever they can. Like I said, their mouth size is such that they can eat just about anything. There's not a whole lot that they can kind of get past them. And they appear to be very aggressive feeders, because we commonly find rocks in their stomach that were likely ingested as they attacked something and just took
sense. Yeah.
get everything they can get along with it. So
What's the average size of these catfish?
it depends on the portion of the river we're looking at. The places where they've more recently invaded, the average size is quite smaller. 8 to 10 pounds is pretty common in these new areas. In the lower portion of the river where they've been living longer, 40 pounds is quite common.
Wow.
And one of our cooperators in the study, Maryland DNR, actually caught a fish in Conowingo pool of 2016 or 17 that was 56 pounds. And that would have been immediately after the spawn. So that fish likely exceeded 60 pounds just a few months earlier. So they get quite large. That's starting to reach the species maximum for these northern populations. I think the world record's somewhere around 100 pounds. So they're just a
Wow.
large fish.
Just eats and eats.
Yep.
Well, I have one more question. Jeff, you and I had talked before, and you mentioned one of the best ways to get rid of these catfish is to catch them and eat them. So I heard you have a really good recipe for the flathead catfish.
Yeah.
But so can we eat the fish that are caught in the Susquehanna River?
Yeah, and I guess I'll preface that by saying we will never get rid of them, but it is a good species to keep in check and take the pressure off other species in terms of consumption. And fish consumption in the Susquehanna River is always governed. The harvest of those fish is governed by our season sizes and creel limits that are in our fishery summary, our regulations are in our, or can be read in our fisheries summary book. And in those books, near the back, we actually publish the fish that have consumption advisories on them and what those advisories are. So those tell you how many fish of each species you can eat, in a given period of time and still be safe. Most species of fish in the river are safe to eat beyond our statewide blanket 1 meal per week advisory, which means any fish species in Pennsylvania, we don't recommend eating more than one time a week due to mercury deposition. Flathead catfish, in this case, are for fish 20 inches or 30 inches and longer, are 1 meal per month. So anything smaller, you could eat 1 meal per week. Anything larger, 1 meal per month as a result of PCBs. But all fish species that have an advisory are present in the book. Anything not present means that it's fine to eat up to that 1 meal per week. That's a blanket statewide recommendation. So it being missing from the book means it's better than being present in the book. And our river fish are actually being tested pretty frequently right now. Fish consumption advisories are through the Department of Health, Fish and Boat Commission, and DEP. And there's a work group that gets together annually to review all the current data collection. And from what I recall, the river species are getting tested about every other year right now. So it's more frequent than anywhere else because a lot of the effort is focused on these large rivers. So they put kind of a lot into the places that people are going to probably be harvesting fish the most.
Well, we have a question from our audience that wants to know a little bit more about the smallmouth bass population. Do you believe the population is doomed, or can the various diseases be mitigated?
I don't believe it's doomed. We see some variation in the population going on. We've largely rebounded from what we saw in the early 2000s to now. Abundance just a few years ago was actually quite high. We followed that with a mortality event in 2019, post-spawning mortality event that's common in bass populations. So we kind of knocked the abundance down a little bit, but it's recovering again. We had a great year classes in 2019 and 2020 to bolster that population. So I think things are going to continue to fluctuate. But it does kind of, with climate change, we have a couple problems probably on the horizon. We're going to start to see more pathogens overlap, and we're going to probably see more diseases just because they never would have encountered each other. But as the temperatures change, they're going to come in line more frequently. And this will pop up more commonly, not only in bass species, but other species as things kind of change. Also, some of the side effects of climate change, like not the temperature as much as the changes in flow patterns. Smallmouth bass riverine populations are strongly driven by flow conditions in June and July, and those are thought to change as storms become larger and more frequent. So that how those populations are affected by that remains yet to be seen. But these are resilient animals. They've made it this long adjusting to conditions. So it's really hard to say how they're going to be affected, but I don't think they're doomed. I think we're going to see fluctuations over time, and these things are going to happen periodically. But it'd be important for us to kind of adapt to them and manage appropriately when they happen.
Well, and with the different agencies and institutions working together, it's yeah. I think their population is going to be preserved. So Now,
and
the question about, oh, go ahead.
the collaborative process we've had through all this stuff has been amazing. Leaning on the other agencies and the other institutions and their knowledge base has been phenomenal. We've developed a really great work group. We work really well together, and we've got a lot of interesting findings that have come out of those collaborations.
And given that the river runs from New York State down to the Chesapeake Bay, you're doing interstate collaborations as well. So
correct. Yeah, so we do both, different agencies within Pennsylvania and different institutions, but we work with all the different agencies around us as well.
That's great.
To make that work.
Well, we have a question about a different fish, the snakehead fish.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about how they got to the river and what's going on with snakehead fish in the Susquehanna.
Yeah, the Susquehanna snakehead population, we think, is largely isolated between Conowingo and Holtwood dams. They first showed up last year when they were moving American shad for those restoration efforts. Some passed through the fishway at Conowingo Dam into the Conowingo Pool portion of the Susquehanna. We have worked with the other agencies and the dam operators to alter our fishway passage opportunities to kind of keep them there until we kind of learn how this behavior is going to occur. So we have a bunch of them isolated between Holtwood and Conowingo dams. They're kind of locked in there right now. It was roughly 20 some fish that were there that passed that last year. We have identified a couple other populations though in nearby water bodies that were likely human introductions, illegal introductions that have occurred as well. So right now they're in the Susquehanna portion of the river. They're kind of in that lower portion and kind of isolated for right now. We have found populations in some of the nearby lakes, Lake Redmond, a water supply lake, a township lake in Lancaster County. So we know some other ones nearby that are there as well. But so far as we know, they're still isolated mainly to the lower Susquehanna River, and hope they stay that way.
One of our listeners wants to know how citizen scientists can help with the research that you're doing for the different fishes in the river.
Yeah, observations are key. We have a portal where you can identify records, typically with a location and a picture to hopefully accompany it for identification of anything they see that they're unsure of. A lot of our snakehead records have come that way. Just someone kind of letting us know, hey, we saw this here. And sure enough, when we go out, yep, that's exactly what they saw and it's where they saw it. So anytime someone comes across something that concerns them or they're unaware, contact us through our homepage in a number of different fashions. And you can submit pictures and location is more beneficial to us. And typically we'll have someone out there shortly to check on it or follow through if the person harvested the fish and let us know a little bit more about it. But anything that's seen that's unknown or concerning, they're more than welcome to contact us, whether it's through our law enforcement or through us as biologists through our main page. It'll get routed to us in one way or the other.
Well, we had a few questions about the inflatable dam on the river.
Yeah.
So where is it? When do you, or not you personally, but when is it inflated or deflated? And how does that affect the water level?
Yeah, so that dam is just downstream of the town of Sunbury in central Pennsylvania, below the confluence of the West Branch. It usually inflates in the spring, in late April or early May. They try to coordinate with them as long as possible to allow any American shad that want to run through to get through there before inflation. So they try to hold off. DCNR owns the dam currently. And then it typically comes down in late September or October at some time. So before the high flows in the fall occur. And it'll raise the river level several feet in that area around the confluence and allow for recreational boating in Shikellamy State Park. So once it's deflated, you really wouldn't know much is there. It's mainly just a riffle at that point, but when it's there, it's 8 to 10 feet tall, I believe.
Wow, that's a dramatic difference. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting setup. It's an inflatable bag.
Wow.
So the technology is pretty cool, but they'll inflate it and deflate it seasonally.
Is it inflated with air or water or?
There.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So it's actually up right now for the summer boating season.
Okay. I might have to go check that out.
Yeah.
Question that might get a little gruesome. Is it recommended not to release a flathead catfish if you catch one? So if you don't want to eat it and you caught it, what do you do with it?
Yeah, we're not telling people to kill them upon capture. That was the initial stance by the agency when they're first detected. It hasn't proven effective in limiting them. But yeah, when people catch them, if they're looking for a fish to eat, we recommend harvesting them and eating them if they catch them, to help limit any spread, especially in places where they're not yet documented and they may be early in this invasion stage. But yeah, and one of the kind of points to take from that is, if you want fish for dinner, something like this may be beneficial over, say, an Atlantic cod or a haddock that species are troubled right now. Or you're kind of taking a species that's burgeoning and expanding its range and replacing it with it and kind of saving a fish that's on tough times. So, and they're actually really great to eat. They're quite delicious. So, don't be concerned about it's going to taste good or not. It is. So that's the recommendation we make, and again, it follows the season, size, and krill. And right now, flathead catfish are combined with other panfish species, fish 50 fish a day, no minimum size limit, and no season.
Wow.
So you can keep them year round in combination with other species up to 50. So there really isn't much of a restriction on flathead at all. If people are interested in harvesting them, to try them.
Is the thought that they were introduced because of the challenge of catching them or because of the tastiness of the fish?
Probably a little bit of both. I think in this area, it probably leans more on the size of the fish. We really don't have a fish of that size in this drainage. So kind of the sport aspect of catching them, the hard fight and the size that they reach was probably the most important factors. But palatability is another one that's commonly documented for their introductions.
Another question, and we're just going to do a couple more. So if we don't get a chance to answer your question, we will submit them to Jeff, and he has very kindly offered to answer them, and we'll send that out when we send out the link for the recording. But a question about fish populations. Does Fish and Boat publish the populations of fish each year for the public to access?
For the more common populations, we tend to do that. The ones that are most in the forefront of the public eye. A lot of our species do not get surveyed annually. So they're only periodically. So you're not getting an annual look at. You're getting maybe every 2 years, 5 years, something. The Susquehanna River is generally every year, barring a flood event or something. And we tend to get those on our webpage as soon as we conduct them and get them completed in the fall. We're kind of on a year or two without them. So probably this fall when I'm out, I'll make sure to get a new one up there that's kind of a more contemporary look at what's going in the population. But for many of our populations that are kind of really focal populations, we tend to post those on the web as web reports. And if anyone's interested in going to look at them on our webpage, we do them statewide. So every region has a series of different ones posted on different species, different lakes or rivers or streams that are done. And if you're looking for information like that, that's the best place to look. Some of this other stuff, the researchy stuff that's a little more advanced, we tend to publish that in journals and people can find them there. Sometimes we kind of break those down into more common lay terms as well and release those. But those I can provide to people as well if they're interested.
So whether people are using the river for fishing or for recreation or just enjoyment, it's really important that we recognize that it is being protected and monitored by our different agencies here in Pennsylvania and in other states to maintain the health of the river and the plants and animals that are in the river.
Yeah, and I would say for the Susquehanna River in particular, there's probably been more research done on this stretch of river than probably any other stretch of river in the United States in recent years. So we've really worked really hard on this stretch of river. There's a lot of really cool information that's come out of the result of it. So even though you might not see us all the time, there's a lot of work going on in the background and a lot of effort going into managing these populations.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I do want to ask, you did mention you have a recipe for flathead catfish. What is I think we're going to publish that.
Yeah.
But in general, is it a fried? Is it
It's a
a
fried catfish, and it's
okay?
quite simple. I'm not a very advanced cook, but you basically soak them in buttermilk overnight, and then roll them in cornmeal type breading and fry them, and they're outstanding.
I'm not anything of a fisherman at all. So if anybody out there does try it, send us an email and let us know what you think of this recipe. So I think we are going to include that in our email post
I am.
conversation. Thank you.
Jeff sent
So-
me a copy, so I will make sure that when I send the email out to everybody, it will be included.
That's great. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today and sharing your valuable information about the Susquehanna River. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next month, we are going to talk with Josh Brown, and we're going to talk about Pennsylvania turtles. If you had joined us a little bit ago, we talked about research that was being done at Wildwood Park by one of our curators here at the State Museum. And this is going to go a little bit more into other species of turtles that we can find throughout Pennsylvania. So Josh Brown will be joining us for that. And if you want to explore more about today's topic, I believe Sherry put some links as well in our chat box, so you can see that. Upcoming topics for our Learn at Lunch times are listed on your page right now, so you can see those. So please go to our website to sign up for those. And we appreciate your attendance. And Jeff, thanks again. And we hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Goodbye.